Hello, and welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Pride and Prejudice. Chapter 16, Thinking About the Past. Elizabeth was completely overwhelmed by Darcy's letter. She didn't think he was sorry for all the pain he had caused Jane. She could not believe Darcy's thinking that Jane had acted indifferently to Bingley. Anyone who had seen them together knew how they both felt. His interference in Bingley's affairs was all about his pride, his sense of dignity, and his notions of Fran's proper place in society. It was nothing more. Wickham, however, was a more complicated case. Darcy's explanation of Wickham connected to his family was exactly what Wickham had told him himself. Moreover, what Wickham had said the parish was still fresh in his mind. "I feel that one of these men is lying to me," she said, "but every time I read and reread the part in the letter about Wickham resigning and receiving money, I hesitate." She thought very carefully of all Wickham had told her and all Darcy had written. She was forced to conclude that Mr. Darcy, who she once thought mean, was innocent of all charges. She realized how odd it was that Wickham should have told his story to her, a total stranger. In truth, she had never heard of Wickham before his entrance into the militia. Nothing had been known about his former life except what he had said himself. She tried to receive one instance of goodness or integrity in Wickham that might rescue him from Mr. Darcy's attack, but she could not think of any. Elizabeth tried to remember the conversation she and Wickham had had. She remembered that he boasted of having no fear of seeing Mr. Darcy, yet it was Wickham who had avoided the Netherfield ball the very next week. She also remembered that until Bingley and Darcy had left Netherfield, he had not uttered a word of his story. It was only after their departure, when he could not disprove his claims, that Wickham launched his attack on Darcy. What a different light this put him in. Clearly he had stopped courting Elizabeth when he learned of her financial state. Every former good feeling evaporated. She had been ill-used by him. She now knew that Darcy was telling the truth about Wickham. Suddenly, Elizabeth felt ashamed of herself. Darcy was prideful, but she had been prejudiced. "How horribly I acted," she cried. "Vanity, not love, has been my folly. I, who pride myself on intelligence, I have courted prejudice and ignorance. I drove away reason whenever I saw it." Her thoughts flew from herself to Jane, and from Jane to Bingley. Was Darcy right about Jane too? He said he was unaware of Jane's feelings. She was forced to admit the truth of that statement. Even Charlotte had told Jane that she should not conceal her true feelings from Bingley. As for his other charge, her family's lack of manners, she had only to remember her mother's behavior at the Netherfield ball. Despite her embarrassment, she could not deny that Darcy was right. Oh, how wrong she had been about everything. She thought again of Bingley. Now that she knew his true feelings for Jane, it heightened that sense of what Jane had lost. His affection had proven sincere. He had wanted to marry her sister, but she had not been sure of her feelings for him. How horrid that Jane had been deprived of happiness by her own restraint and her family's lack of social grace. To these thoughts were added the realization of Wickham's true character. He had deceived her. Painfully unhappy, she spent each day until her departure studying Darcy's letter. Soon she knew it almost all by heart. Though she appreciated his statement to her, she was still at odds with him. But would she ever see him again? Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam left Rosings the next morning. Elizabeth made her arrangements to return to Longbourn. Her one consolation was going home. She parted from Lady Catherine, who wished her a good journey and invited her to come to Hunsford again next year. It was that second week in May when Elizabeth returned home. Her sisters were delighted to see her. Kitty and Lydia quickly filled her in all the local gossip. "I have some interesting news," said Lydia triumphantly. "There is no danger of Wickham marrying Mary King. She has gone down to her uncle Liverpool. Dear Wickham is safe." "And Mary King is safe," added Elizabeth. "Safe from a man who only loves her money." While her younger sister talked endlessly about the love affairs of the army officers, Elizabeth told Jane All exciting news about Mr. Darcy. I thought I was so clever, disliking him so, Elizabeth admitted. Dislike sometimes sharpens one's wit. You must be extremely disappointed that you refused him, Jane said. Indeed, replied Elizabeth. I am sorry if I caused him pain. You wouldn't blame me for refusing him, do you? Blame you? Oh, no. There was something else, she added, and she learned all about what she had learned about George Wickham from Mr. Darcy. I wanted to ask you, Jane, do you think I ought to make people aware of Wickham's true character? For my part, I am inclined to believe Mr. Darcy, concluded Elizabeth, but what should I do? There was clearly great mismanagement in the education of those two young men. One has all the goodness, and the other has all the appearance of it, she said, shaking her hand in wonder. Jane paused a little and then replied, Surely there can be no need for exposing him so dreadfully. What do you think? That it ought not to be attempted, Mr. Darcy swore me to secrecy. Wickham will soon be gone, therefore no need to know what he's really like. Right. You're quite right, Jane nodded. To have his heirs made public might ruin him forever. What Elizabeth didn't reveal to Jane was the rest of Darcy's letter. She didn't tell her how much Bingley loved her. It pained her to keep their secret, since she knew this made Jane unhappy. Her sister, after an 8-month separation, still cherished a tender love for Bingley. If Bingley was on Jane's mind, the departure of the regiment from Meryton occupied the thoughts of the other ladies in the neighborhood. Kitty and Lydia Bennet were nearly hysterical. They fretted that their endless social world had come to an end. Good heavens, what is to become of us? What are we to do? Lydia exclaimed bitterly. If we could just go to Brighton, observed Mrs. Bennet. She and Lydia have been invited to the lively seaside resort by Colonel and Mrs. Forster. Oh, yes, agreed Lydia, if we could only go to Brighton, but Papa refused to take a holiday at the seaside. Such were the complaints that resounded throughout the Bennet house. Elizabeth could almost hear Darcy's objection to her family's silly remarks. So annoying were they that she could almost forgive him for his interference in Bingley's life. To be saddled with such a shallow family. Elizabeth could decide to speak her father of the situation. If you are aware, said Elizabeth, of the great disadvantage Lydia's manners give us. Has she frightened away some of your suitors? Smiled Mr. Bennet. Father, our respectability in the world is affected by her wild character. If you do not restrain her, she'll be beyond reach. Her character will be fixed, and she will, at 16, be the most outrageous flirt. She makes herself vain, and the family look ridiculous. She is vain, idle, and uncontrollable. Do not make yourself uneasy, my dear. Rest assured you and Jane are respected and valued wherever you go. We shall have no peace at Longbourn if Lydia does not go to Brighton. Colonel Forster is a sensible man. He will keep her out of any real mischief. Don't forget, he said, wagging his finger at her, she is too poor for a young man to pursue. Let's hope Brighton visit will teach her how important she really is. Elizabeth was forced to be content with the answer. Her mother and Lydia soon left for Brighton. Elizabeth, meanwhile, decided to see Mr. Wickham one last time. On the very last day of the regiment's stay in Meryton, a party was held in the barracks. Wickham sat with Elizabeth. He asked how she had enjoyed Hunsford, and she mentioned Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy being at Rosings. Do you know Colonel Fitzwilliam? She asked. He looked surprised, displeased, and alarmed. He replied that he believed Fitzwilliam to be a gentleman. Did Elizabeth like him? His manners are very different from Mr. Darcy's, she said, but I like Mr. Darcy the more I get to know him. Really? Said Wickham with a wild look in his eye. What I mean is that the more I get to know him, the more I understand why he acts the way he does, Elizabeth explained. Wickham was looking more and more nervous and alarmed by the minute. I assume that he merely gives the appearance of doing what's right. The different from doing the right thing. I just hope his pride will never prevent him in the future from harming others as he has harmed me. Elizabeth could not repress a smile at the hearing. They said their goodbyes politely, though both secretly they hoped they had seen the last of each other. When the dinner ended, little Lydia returned with Miss Forster to to Meryton. She was to travel on to Brighton the next day. And that is the end of that chapter. I will see you later.